On behalf of Dear Dyslexic, welcome to our webinar, Decision Making in a Crisis. Hello, I'm Norman Chorn. I'm a non-executive director on the board of Dear Dyslexic. I work as a consultant and organizational advisor. My background is in economics and behavioral sciences, and I think you'll see this when we go through the various issues relating to strategic thinking and decision making. I try to adopt a completely holistic approach by combining some of the more rational aspects of economics and strategy with the concepts of the brain and insights from behavioral economics. So let's get right into it and get underway and really start our webinar this evening. So tonight we'll deal with 5 concepts. We'll talk about what it really means to be in a crisis. How does this impact on people? And very closely related to that, how do our brains function? What does thinking in a crisis look like? What does thinking look like per se, but what does it look like in a crisis? And what are some of the common myths in decision making? And then finally, we'll look at how we might enhance our approach to strategic thinking and decision making. So at the moment, we're currently experiencing what I guess many of you might call a crisis. The whole COVID-19 situation, the pandemic, and the various issues around lockdown and restricted access and movement. So what does this mean? Well, I guess in terms of how it affects us as human beings, it means we have a lot of uncertainty. We don't know the extent of the virus, how quickly it'll spread, when the lockdown will be lifted. We're experiencing a significant lack of control. Our ability to really influence how and when we go about our lives is really pretty much out of our control at the moment. There's a sense of randomness. So we don't know when it's going to strike. We don't know when it's going to hit. We don't know how it's going to affect communities. And in a sense, to the outside observer, like you and I, it seems somewhat a random process. Our feeling of insignificance is also perhaps highlighted in the situations. Our inability to really affect the overall outcome that it is having on us and our society. And finally, of course, as a result of the isolation, as a result of the restricted access we have to public gatherings and our friends and family, a sense of loneliness. So what I want to do is I want to explore what this means from the perspective of the brain. How does our brain really function? And how does this really impact our brain and our ability to think strategically and make decisions? So the first thing to recognize and to note is that our brain, as complex and diverse an organ as it is, really has one simple overall goal. And that is to protect us from danger. The brain works to minimize the threats that we face on our day-to-day lives, in our day-to-day lives, but also to maximize reward. But the key to understanding how this particular process works is to recognize that the amount of threat circuits that we have in our brain, our threat circuitry is 5 times as great as our reward circuitry. So there's a natural tendency to really conserve and to protect before seeking reward. So we naturally are conservative, and we will seek to prevent the downside in most situations before we actually seek to maximize reward. Now, very simple way to understand how the brain works is to recognize 2 overall parts of the brain. There are obviously many more, and I'm not going to bore you with the physiology or the anatomy of the brain. Safe to say that we're going to focus on 2 parts. We're going to focus on the limbic system, which is this large mass of the brain. It's the oldest part of the brain, the most developed part of the brain. And then secondly, in front, in a very small part of the overall cortex of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, or what we will call the PFC. PFC is the newest part of our brain and generally develops fairly late In fact, we find that in men it will develop at around age 22 to 24, whereas in women it might develop a few years earlier. Now, in order to explain the way that these two parts of the brain work, I'm going to use an analogy of Star Wars. Those of you that are familiar with the genre might know that the two key characters in Star Wars are in fact Luke Skywalker, he's the fellow with the green lightsaber, and Darth Vader. And so we're going to use this as an analogy to really explain how these two parts of the brain function and work together. So, non-conscious limbic system represented by Darth Vader, the big, experienced, dark warrior with enormous amounts of stamina and street smart, wily, very, very powerful warrior and very effective. On the other side of the coin then, Luke Skywalker is younger, still learning his trade, but he's very intelligent. He's the smarts on the street here. He really understands things at a very, very high level, very intellectual, but he has much less stamina, much less experience. So these two are generally pitted for control over how we think and make decisions. And in fact, the way to really understand this is that Luke Skywalker, with all his intelligence but lack of stamina, and Darth Vader, with his street smart fighting cunning ability, with lots of stamina, are pitted in an ongoing battle for how we really use our brain and make key decisions and think strategically. Don't make the mistake of thinking this is about good versus evil, because it's not. It's just about the different modes that we have of functioning and the way that our brain actually will make decisions for us. So let's understand which particular roles each play. Luke Skywalker is essentially the conscious part of the brain. It manages what we call the executive functions, those abilities that we have to plan, prioritize, make trade-offs, all the sort of intellectual stuff that we can use when we really kind of do things like analysis and judgment. So Luke Skywalker has the ability to manage and view probabilities, to trade one off against the other, and so to manage risk. A good example might be when you're looking at two options for going to work on a rainy day. You might want to take your car because it'll allow you to stay dry and actually arrive at work in a reasonably respectable condition. But because most other people will do the same, the roads will probably be busy and you might be late for that important meeting. Traveling on public transport, on the other hand, might be quicker with less disruptions. But of course, you run the risk of getting wet. So in a sense, neither of those two are good or bad. They're just different options. And what you need to do is to manage the risk of choosing one over the other. Excuse me. Now, the key thing to know about Luke Skywalker is that, and the whole functioning of the PFC, is that it's very energy intensive. It consumes a lot of energy. A very high proportion of energy that the brain consumes is consumed by the PFC, and it's very fussy. So energy intensiveness means that when you are hungry, Luke Skywalker and your PFC tend to become less effective. The fussiness really relates to the fact that he's easily distracted. Anything that moves or any loud noise will distract him. And as a result of that, he can only perform optimally in very quiet and controlled conditions. Luke Skywalker is also a serial processor, prefers and is definitely more capable of doing one job at a time. And in a sense, that really calls into question our ability to multitask. We know that the ability to multitask is confined to an exceptionally small proportion of our population. And I might add, women are not necessarily any better than men in multitasking. We generally suffer huge loss of efficiency and accuracy in multitasking. So serial processing, one job at a time, is definitely the better way to go. And Luke can only handle a few bits of information at any point in time. So his ability to really juggle more than 4 or 5 pieces of information at the same time is fairly limited. Darth Vader, on the other hand, is really the seat of the non-conscious. That's really where our long-term memory and all our emotions are housed. Darth Vader really makes the decisions about what we're going to move away from, i.e. what is dangerous, and what we're going to move towards. So this is really the emotional reaction center, where a lot of our involuntary, autonomous actions are really guided and directed. Now, importantly, what we need to understand is that Darth Vader takes over when the PFC is depleted. When Luke Skywalker checks out, either because he's hungry or tired or overwhelmed, this is when Darth Vader steps in and says, "Don't worry about a thing, I'll take over here." And the difference between Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader is very clear. Darth Vader is very decisive, makes decisions very quickly and generally in a binary fashion. So it's either right or wrong, left or right, on or off, this way or that way. And as a result, he tends to be very risk averse. So most of his decision making, which is taken very quickly, is really taken with a view to really limit the amount of risk we face. So generally things like probabilities and trade-offs don't necessarily get performed particularly well here. Darth Vader simply says, "I don't like it, we're not going to do it," and that's it. Now, that's got significant implications, particularly when you are highly stressed or rushing around in a tremendous, at a very high pace, maybe moving from meeting to meeting, or perhaps in a great hurry to do things in a small amount of time. When you're overwhelmed and you have too much going on and there are too many events occurring, or there's too much information that you're having to take in, or when you're tired and hungry. Under these conditions, you will find that Darth Vader steps in. This is really not the territory for Luke Skywalker to function in. So Darth Vader is really in control when we're highly stressed, when we're in a rush, when we're in action orientation mode, when we're trying to do too many things at once, when we might be overwhelmed by too much information. There's just too many things to really kind of get our heads around, or indeed when we're tired and hungry. So hangry actually is a real concept, and that obviously has real implications for the way we respond to situations. So if we just think about the way that we respond to a particular phenomenon, a stimulus, an event, there really are two broad types of responses in our repertoire. We talk about a reflexive response, which is something we do almost automatically, habitually, without necessarily thinking deeply about it. And that's clearly a Darth Vader type of response. That's Darth Vader's territory. Or we might respond in a reflective way, perhaps where we really stop and pause and really think carefully about what it is we have to do, and really propose or develop a fairly considered response. So those two types of responses, which we will return to a little later, form the core of how we as human beings might respond in a situation. And you can see why in a crisis, for example, we are more inclined to respond reflexively because we are faced with great danger. And as we know, the brain tends to keep us away from danger, and Darth Vader, particularly when we're stressed, tends to make reflexive decisions to move away from danger. So our tendency, therefore, to be more reflexive is heightened during a period of crisis or threat or stress. Now we might turn our attention to how we actually think. What is the thinking process that can be understood when you look at the way we use our brains or we use our intellectual capabilities? What we see is that there are actually three particular phases of strategic thinking. The first phase is where we actually figure out what's going on. We identify the facts. We ask ourselves, what's happened here? Who's done what to whom? Has something happened? What's going on? And that's essentially what we would call an analysis phase, where it's simply about seeing what's actually happening. The phase that follows, or should follow, in strategic thinking is an insight phase, where we tend to boil the data down or boil the information down, and we group the information, we regroup it, we abstract it. We essentially try to look at this information from a number of different perspectives and ask ourselves, what does this really mean? And this is an insight phase where in a sense the analysis doesn't it's in itself reveal the true meaning of the data. It just tells us what the data is. The insight phase tells us, what does this actually mean in our lives? What does this mean for the situation? And finally, once we've figured that out, we move into another analysis phase where we figure out the logical best approach to take. So what's going on? What does it mean? And what do we have to do about it? Now, an important thing that we need to point out at this stage is that while analysis, the two green stages, can be performed and are generally performed when you're in the situation, the insight phase is best achieved when you step back from the situation, when you pause and actually move away from the information, when you literally leave the dance floor and get up onto the balcony so you might view the situation from a distance. It's often introduced, or it's often developed when we are doing something completely different. So we might be reading a book, or we might be going for a walk, or we might be playing a game of golf or reading a story to our kids, something completely unrelated to the issue. And suddenly we'll get a creative insight that'll actually tell us, oh, this is what this information really means. And now I know what it is that I should do. But what's important here is to understand that when we're in a rush, when we're in an action-orientated environment, when we perceive some danger or threat, we often move from what's going on straight to what are we going to do? What's going on? What are we going to do? So we literally skip out that middle insight phase. And as a result, the quality of our strategic thinking is severely hampered because of that. So what that means then is that while there are two broad types of responses, reflective and reflexive, there are actually three kinds of thinking. So we've covered the reflexive approach, and safe to say that the reflexive approach is highly subjective. It generally tends to reference your needs, your preferences, and relies on your habits that you might have stored over the years or developed as a series of techniques to deal with often repeated situations. The two reflective approaches, on the other hand, work in different ways. The analysis and the insight phases, which we've just looked at, are slightly different approaches to the way we might actually think. The analytical focus really is a logical perspective. And it kind of says what's needed here, what's going on, and it tends to follow a fairly logical, linear type of approach. Whereas the insight process, which is sometimes called elastic thinking, tends to be a balance between conscious and non-conscious thinking. It kind of relies on what you know and also what your deepest kind of memories might have recalled about similar situations. So it's a very non-linear process, and it combines multiple threads of thought. And it does so generally when we're offline, when we're away from the situation. And that's why we talk about it as being an elastic process, because it is creative and it comes about as a result of this combination of different threads of thought. So as we go through and we mull over the information, we look at it from different angles. The brain actually makes thousands and thousands and thousands of connections to different parts and different memories and different pieces of information, and tries the various combinations until it finds one that kind of makes sense. And that's when you get that aha moment. Ah, I found the answer. I know what to do. So we need to be aware then that while both a reflective analysis and insight are quite different and need to be approached differently, and while analysis is done when you're in the situation, insight generally occurs when you remove yourself from the situation. Now we need to introduce another variable into this whole issue, which is the impact of complexity. So complex situations, as opposed to complicated situations, are ones where there is no clear answer, is one where there is a multiplicity of ideas and opinions, and you can never really get the right answer. It's where you can only seek to get an optimum answer, which kind of optimizes the situations. You might actually call it some form of compromise. So let's try and understand the distinction between the two. And incidentally, some of you might be familiar with the Cynefin process of David Snowden. And I don't have time to really go into the Cynefin framework now, but those of you who are interested might actually want to Google Cynefin process, C-Y-N-E-F-I-N. And what he does, what Snowden does, is he really outlines the clear distinctions that exist between complicated challenges and complex challenges. So a complicated challenge generally occurs in what is otherwise a relatively stable and predictable environment. It's one for which there is an established solution. You might call it best practice or good practice. So for example, if you're an engineer and you're building a bridge, there is an established way to build a bridge. You take into account all the geographical factors, the condition of the soil and the firmness of the ground. You look at the load that has to be carried, you look at the wind conditions and so on. And you apply a formula and you can actually derive maybe not best practice, but good practice solutions. Importantly, it's a situation in which there's a direct relationship between cause and effect. So you can actually trace the impact of something by adjusting what you do. So for example, the engineer can change the material that he uses to build a bridge and figure out very quickly what the impact of that might be. Now, when you consider a complex challenge, these are generally things that occur in a fluid and somewhat more unpredictable way. As I mentioned, these are things for which there are many different points of view, many options, and as a consequence, if you are a decision maker or a strategic thinker in that situation, you have to find an optimum solution. It may not be the right solution, but it's an optimum solution. Some examples might be poverty or world hunger, or indeed the best way to deal with a worldwide pandemic, which provides both challenges for medicine and for the economy. And how do you balance those two? Again, you don't have a right answer, you only have optimum solutions for a particular situation. So the important thing to understand about a complex challenge then is one cause has multiple effects. We can't find the right answer. We have to find an optimum answer. And importantly, what is the optimum answer for Australia in a situation like COVID-19 might not be the optimum solution for another country or another jurisdiction. You have to study the system and you have to find the optimum solution in that situation. Now, why am I talking about this? I'm talking about this because we need to understand that the thinking frameworks and tools and techniques which we use under these conditions will have to be quite different. While we can use things like SWOT analysis and decision trees, which are fairly traditional engineering-based approaches in a complicated environment, for a complex environment, we have to use completely different tools. Things like Blue Ocean Strategy, which promotes creative solutions, and scenario planning, which envisages alternative futures which occur in a complex environment. And those are really important factors to understand because it simply means that part of actually doing a good job of strategic thinking means that we actually also need to recognize that we have to use the right tools. So to summarize that, it simply means that for complicated problems, we can use analysis, but for complex problems, insight is the way to go, which essentially means that you can achieve a solution to a complicated problem by focus and concentration and staying close to the data. Whereas a complex problem, you achieve an optimum solution by taking some time out and reflecting deeply, perhaps for long periods of time, about different ways in which that information might be boiled down and made sense of. Importantly, a very key factor relating to a complex problem such as COVID-19, such as poverty or world hunger, is the fact that it produces and drives uncertainty. So we know in a complicated system, cause equals effect, or there's a direct relationship between cause and effect. Whereas in a complex system, cause has multiple effects. So rather frighteningly, what does that mean? It means that if you're in a complex system and you stand here in the present, you cannot think about the future as one particular destination. Standing here in a complex environment, in a complex system, we have to acknowledge that there are multiple futures. There are alternative ways in which the future can unfold, because there's so many variables interacting in so many different ways that you find that there are multiple futures that have to be accounted for. And that is why our straightforward, linear, logical approach of making decisions in a crisis doesn't necessarily work. We cannot simply say, this is our objective, we want to achieve such and such by such a date, and then simply plan forward as we might do in a conventional, complicated environment. We're not building a bridge here. We're trying to find an optimum solution in an environment for which there are multiple futures. So that presents a whole range of issues and challenges for us as we try to make decisions in a crisis or in a complex system which produces high levels of uncertainty, which is actually what a crisis is. Right, so now it's time to start examining decision-making and decision-making practices. And one of the things I'd like to do, and I've been very interested in this, is to really understand some of the common practices which we use in decision-making that are not all that productive. I like to call them the myths, the unicorns of decision-making, and I've identified 5 of them, and we'll go through each one. Each one of these in turn we will deal with. So let's start with the first one, which is that in order to make good decisions, we need to collect maximum amounts of information and keep our options open until the last minute. The problem with that approach, given the fact that we have human brains, is that it causes a lot of confusion and it causes a loss of focus. Imagine going into a restaurant that has 57 pages in the menu, and each page has got 10 menu options. There's an enormous amount of confusion and loss of focus, and as a consequence, you don't really know what to do and what to choose. So we know the solution from a mathematical point of view and lots of research on the issue. The solution in this situation is to use an approach which is called the optimal stopping point. Now, if you're interested in the optimal stopping point, Google it and you'll find very, very complex mathematical formulae to really justify why the answer is 37%. And let me explain. Let's assume that you have 100 choices, 100 options, should I say, from which to make a choice. Let's assume that you're trying to rent an apartment or trying to buy an apartment or trying to choose a car. And just hypothetically, you have 100 particular options from which to choose. Now, what we know from the optimal stopping point, which is a very elegant and powerful theory, which can be proved time and again, is once you have actually considered 37% of your options, so if you have 100 options, once you've actually seen 37% or 37 of those options, you are in the best position to choose. And your basis of choice is that having seen 37 of the 100, simply choose the best one you've seen out of the 37, and that will be your optimum solution. Because what we're trying to balance here is we're trying to balance between making a decision too quickly or taking too long to make the decision. So making a decision too early means that you really not actually considered all the evidence. But viewing all the evidence might mean that by the time you actually reach a solution, if you can, it's too late to really do anything about it. So that's why we call it the optimal stopping point. And the answer is surprisingly 37. So collecting maximum information, keeping your options open and right until the end is not a good decision-making technique, popular as it is. The second one is an interesting one, and that is that experts will always know best. Now, what's interesting about this and all the research that's been done in behavioral economics about this by people like Daniel Kahneman and Tversky, his previous and now deceased partner, who collaborated with him on the whole Nobel Prize winning concept of thinking fast and thinking slow, and other very, very well-known and well-researched behavioral economists, is that while the expert might have the best information, one of the things we find is that because they're also human beings, they actually ignore their own guidelines. They ignore their own principles upon which they generally base decision making. And they're inconsistent in their application. So they may know how, for example, to diagnose a particular condition, but they ignore their own guidelines when they do the diagnosis themselves, and they're inconsistent. So what we know the best solution here is in fact, if you have the ability to gather these expert guidelines and rules and put them into artificial intelligence or some kind of an algorithm or some kind of set of checklists and procedures, you're going to be far better off. So in a sense, you might regard in a banking situation that so-and-so is a very good judger of credit worthiness. But while that individual might know the rules to judge credit worthiness, the bank is far better off taking those rules and putting them into an algorithm or a model or artificial intelligence and allow the machine to really kind of come up with a conclusion. We see this in medicine quite a lot, where in oncology, we know that really great oncologists can tell us what to look for in a tumor to diagnose whether it's malignant or simply benign. But actually they themselves are not always necessarily consistent or accurate in the way they apply their own guidelines, which is why computers are far better at scanning tumors and coming up with a decision on whether it's malignant or benign or whether it requires further information to really understand them. If you don't have that option, then seek several opinions from several experts, find a pattern between them, and then make your decision, because they will not be consistent, as you have probably found out yourself. My personal favorite is the so-called law of averages, because there is no law of averages. But nonetheless, you all know that there's a kind of a myth that says if you're flipping a coin 50% of the time, it'll land on heads, and 50% of the time, it'll land on tails. But every time you flip that coin, the coin has no memory of how it landed the last time. So simply because somebody has flipped a coin 6 times and it's landed on heads, you think, well, it's got to land on tails this time. It doesn't necessarily hold. The event and the coin has no memory of how they last landed. The roulette wheel has no memory of whether it landed on red or black last time. And so we tend to stick to these old-fashioned beliefs, things like lightning never strikes twice in the same place. Well, a far better approach is, in fact, to recognize that some of these views, some of these old-fashioned views, are simply sunk costs. And I like to say that what we need to do under those circumstances is to rent rather than buy. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm simply saying hold your views lightly. Be prepared to change your mind based on the evidence. Any attempt to hold steadfastly to long-held beliefs is not necessarily going to help you make great decisions here. So if you rent an apartment, you're far more likely to seek another apartment which is more convenient to your new job than if you own that apartment, because you may have rather more restrictions in terms of being able to sell it and buy another. So hold your views lightly is a much better approach to take under these situations. The fourth myth, which was really popularized by books like Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, is that there's a view that intuition is much faster and easier to use in situations of high levels of complexity. And it's based on the notion that someone who's kind of looking at a very complex situation will kind of say, well, you know, Joe up the road does this when these things happen, so I'm going to use his or her best practice, because it's much easier to do it than to do all the analysis and reflection and so on. But we actually know that intuition is particularly unreliable. That's sometimes not a very nice thing to hear, because we always trust our gut, as we say. In fact, we know that intuition is not very reliable, and there are only really three types of situations in which it should be used. The first one is where you are, where you are a recognized expert. So let's say you are a world chess master, or you're a champion chess player and you've been recognized as such. That's probably giving you permission, or that's probably making it viable for you to use intuition when deciding on your next move, because you've actually practiced this and you've actually built in heuristics which actually are based on fact and an understanding of how the game works. So when you're a recognized expert in an area, that's where intuition is effectively permissible or will produce good results. Another situation in which you can use it is where the system has regular patterns. So for example, if you're in software development, you know that software development has a particular pattern. Software works in certain particular ways, which is quite pattern orientated. If you know the system in which you are working has regular patterns, you can tend to trust your intuition. And thirdly, you can trust your intuition if you've been working in a space in which you get immediate feedback every time you make a decision. So a rather kind of weird example here might be a bomb disposal expert. I mean, if you actually have managed to diffuse large numbers of bombs and they haven't blown up in your face, you probably have been given very good immediate feedback and can learn to trust your intuition in those situations. So it's not a particularly useful or reliable approach in complex and uncertain situations. You're better off using other approaches such as scenario planning and the like. And finally, this assumption we make, and certainly that economists make, and I know I trained for many years as an economist, and I now understand that so many of the basic principles upon which economics is based are just fundamentally wrong, because they don't take into account that humans are in fact irrational. They're predictably irrational, but they are not rational. So the problem here is that if we assume that humans make rational decisions, we're ignoring the fact that in fact people use heuristics in making decisions. A heuristic is a kind of a rule of thumb. It's like a little shortcut technique which we've developed to make decisions, and there are many of those. Sometimes we call them biases, sometimes we call them rules of thumb, but the correct term is really heuristics. These are shorthand techniques that people make, which are often based on association when we make our decisions. So what we need to do is we need to check whether these heuristics are being used, and we need to put checks and balances in place. I'll just run through three of the sort of common heuristics that people would use. So the first one is the availability heuristic, which means that you tend to really choose the answer that is most available in your memory. So that may be something you recently read, It may be an example you recently saw, or it may be a case that you were recently involved in. Maybe an experience you had in your last job, and you get a problem which kind of looks similar, and you think, well, oh, I know what to do because I had a similar experience in my last job. What you really are experiencing there is an availability bias. The fact that that solution is readily available in your mind because it's fresh, because you had a recent experience on it. The second heuristic is what we call the IKEA effect. So you've all been down to IKEA, you've all gone and bought a cupboard and spent many happy or unhappy hours trying to assemble the cupboard, with lots of advice from all kinds of people telling you how not to do it and how to do it. Eventually, after multiple hours and sweat and cursing, you manage to put the cupboard together. And then someone says, gee, I don't really like that cupboard. And you say, why? I think that's a fantastic cupboard. I really like that cupboard. It's a great cupboard. What you're suffering from there is the bias or heuristic that you tend to prefer things and like things that you've put a lot of effort into. So if you've been a lifelong Ford owner and buyer and user, then you're going to have a preference for Ford. Anything that looks like a Ford, you're actually going to prefer. So things that you own or things that you've put a lot of effort into or spent a lot of money buying, you will tend to have a somewhat biased impression about how good and how effective those things really are. Those will be the kinds of solutions you will tend to go after more often. And the last heuristic is framing. So framing is in fact the way that the problem or challenge is presented to you. So if I said to you, madam, for your particular ailment, I have this new experimental surgery that I can recommend. 90% of the cases are highly successful. Or if I said to you, madam, for your particular ailment that you're suffering, I have a new experimental surgery that I can offer you. In 10% of the cases, it fails and causes death. Now, both those sentences, 90% success rate, 10% failure, are really the same information. What we know, though, is that you are far more likely to choose an option which has 90% success rate than one that has 10% failure rate. And that's just simply because of the way the challenge has been framed. So when you find that you have decisions to make, just make sure that you put in place checks and balances, maybe checklists, or you have people look at what you've decided on and actually question you about it. Make sure that you haven't used any of these heuristics, perhaps unconsciously or non-consciously, and maybe made a shortcut decision without necessarily considering the best outcomes possible or the best way to solve the problem. I like to say putting tripwires in place will help you to check that you're not biased in your decision making. Okay, and so we end our webinar this evening, or today, depending on what time you're watching this, of course, with a series of practical techniques that you can use to enhance your own strategic thinking. So the first thing that I would say to you when making decisions in a crisis is to be honest about what you know and what you don't know, and be open and transparent. It is not a sign of strength to know all the answers all the time. And in fact, you will find that you are far more authentic and believable. And if you're a leader, you are far more likely to be followed if you're honest about what you know and quite open about what you don't know. So be open, transparent, and talk openly about, look, I don't know the answers to this aspect, but this is what I can tell you. So I don't know when this is going to end or how it's going to end, but this is what I can tell you. And I think you'll find that to be a far better approach. Be honest and open. Secondly, when you're in a crisis, it's a good idea to identify where you are. Are you in triage, where you're trying to repair the damage, where you're trying to kind of fix what is seriously broken and you're hurting? Because that is quite different from being in a position of reimagining what the future might look like. and what possible new approach you could take into the future. If someone's really hurting, there's no point in actually at that stage kind of helping them to reimagine what it might be in the future. But far better to administer triage to help them solve their immediate problem. But once that is done, the reimagining phase is all about figuring out what are you going to do tomorrow, what could a new business model look like, what could a new solution look like. And finally then, there is the reinvention phase, which is about how you start building and constructing this new business model. So the point really here is to identify where you are and make sure that you attend to the relevant problem, not try to mix them all up at the same time. Oh, and incidentally, if you lead a team, you probably find that the people who are good at triage are not the good people that are good at reimagining. So if you're in the middle of this crisis and things are going badly wrong, then you need a group of people, or you need a focus to do the triage and a very different focus to do the reimagining. So know where you are in the crisis, because the solution in each case is quite different and the approach you have to take is quite different. I think something that really relates to how we respond, whether it's reflexively or reflectively, is important here. And that is to make sure that you actually create a purposeful pause. So the one thing that we do have over other species is our ability to pause between stimulus and response. You know, my dogs, no matter how much I love them and how much they love me and how well trained they are, if I tug at their tail very suddenly, they'll turn around and bite me, because that's just an instinctive, reflexive, or scripted response that dogs have. Humans don't though. Humans have the ability to pause and actually reflect on what's best to be done here. So one of the things to really do is to actually purposefully create pauses, even if it's only for a second, before answering, before deciding what you're going to do. And that's got two effects. One is it allows you to actually reset your brain and actually consider what needs to be done here before reflexively reacting. And two, it gives you a sense of control over your environment, even though you know that actually there isn't much of an option here. But simply fooling your brain to think that there is an option and that you have control promotes a much greater sense of well-being than this helplessness you feel when you have no control. And remember, although we have to act quickly in a crisis, it doesn't mean we have to act reflexively. There's a difference between quick reaction and reflexive action. Number 4, use Napoleon's approach. Now, Napoleon is a favorite kind of historical figure of mine, given his success that he had as a military strategist. And essentially what he did, without getting into too much detail here, is that he tended to follow 4 basic principles. The first principle was that he always knew and studied the history and the background of the battle. So he was at military college, and he in fact spent time from the age of 12 at the French Military Academy, and he was highly skilled at understanding the theory and the history of military battles and how you win in these different situations. So I think the point to be taken out of this is that study the facts before you get into the situation as best you can. Secondly, he immersed himself in the situation. He wasn't an armchair general. He spent time with the troops. He actually went down to where they were, listened to their stories, drank wine with them, discussed, asked their opinion, and really got a first-hand view of what's going on. So I think the thing that is really important here is to recognize that while studying the data and getting reports from other people about what's going on is important and useful, it's a good idea, if at all possible, to immerse yourself in the situation. Because what you do is you give your brain an emotional context to the information. You give yourself a sense of a deep knowledge from a personal point of view of what's really going on. Now, what's really important at this point in time is that you actually don't jump to conclusions, that you actually don't make any prejudgments, and that you forget everything you learnt and you remain quite neutral. Simply collect the information. Your third stage is to retreat to reflect. He used to spend time with the troops, and then Napoleon would actually go back into his tent, tell his guards to not allow any of his generals or officers to disturb him. He just wanted some time to reflect. And what he was actually doing here was he was literally separating himself from the noise and the visual stimulus of what was going on in the battle. And he was allowing his non-conscious aspects of his brain to really work as well. He was looking to create the opportunity for multiple threads of thought to be combined. What he'd seen, what he knew from history, other experiences, and essentially looking at all this information from multiple points of view. And he knew that out of that would come an insight. Now, what's important to understand is that we don't know how long it's going to take for you to get that insight. All we know is that unless you create the necessary preconditions, that insight will not occur. And once you get the insight, you act with conviction. You know that you've solved it and you've really got the best answer you possibly can. So that's that eureka moment. That's that creative moment where you suddenly realize how all these bits kind of fit together. And they generally do when you are offline, because the brain doesn't stop working. When you sleep, the brain doesn't stop working. When you're out walking the dog, or when you're cooking, or when you're watching a movie or listening to music, it's still mulling all these things over. So that's Napoleon's approach, sometimes called strategic insight or strategic intuition. Try multiple perspectives or points of view. Ask different people. Recognize that they come at the problem from different perspectives. Get their views. See what kind of fits together. Because essentially, when you construct an understanding from different points of view, you get what is known as a 3D or rich picture. It's a picture which is actually made up of different perspectives, and that generally produces a much richer understanding. You know, we understand that what you see of the mountain depends on where you stand. So if you move around the mountain, you get a 3D picture and a much better understanding of what's going on. So multiple points of view, different mental models, people with engineering backgrounds, people with kind of behavioral science backgrounds, you know, people from different walks of life have all got different approaches. Choose the right time of day. So, when should you do analytical tasks where you need to concentrate and focus? Well, best done in the morning with bright lights and minimum distraction. And when should you do creative tasks? Well, generally speaking, in the early afternoon, when the brain starts getting a little tired and starts making more random connections. You can do those with dimmer lights in the canteen or cafe where there's lots of distraction, because that just promotes this random kind of connection between different kind of thought streams. Warren Buffett always says, change your time horizon. So if you're struggling with a decision, even if it's in a crisis, particularly if it's in a crisis, try the 10-10-10 method. Ask yourself, how will I feel about this decision in 10 days' time? How will I feel about it in 10 months? And how will I feel about it in 10 years? Or if you don't like those times, how will I feel about this in 10 minutes, in 10 hours, and in 10 days? And it just kind of helps you move away from this, I've got to do this now, I've got to do this now, I've got to do this now. It just forces you to think about some of the implications on a longer term basis of your decision. It kind of gets you out of your reflexive mode and gets you to think more reflectively. Some of you might recognize The Mentalist, that very interesting series where this character was able to read the minds, as it were, of different people. Well, there is an approach called mentalizing, adopting a mentalist view, and this is how it works. So in the situation that you're trying to make a decision in, treat it like a novel. Treat the situation like a novel you're reading or a movie you're watching. Because in those situations, you see the major characters or the stakeholders as you see them as characters in the novel or book or movie. So if you're in a situation with different points of view and different stakeholders adopting a different perspective, see them as a character in a novel or a book or a movie. And kind of, because you know, when you go to the movies or when you read a book, you pretty quickly form a view of each of the characters. What are their motives? What are their likes and dislikes? What are their triggers? What they're likely to do under different circumstances and so on. And, you know, unless it's a really, really, really kind of complex movie, you pretty much can start figuring out who's going to do what. And so when you understand their personalities, their motives, their drivers, and their triggers, you're now in a very powerful position, much more powerful position to understand what might happen. And once you've done that, you can work out what they want and how they are likely to react. So all these stakeholders in the situation are characters in your movie or novel, and you now are studying them as characters, figuring out what they want, how they're likely to react. And now you're in a position to figure out what the leverage points are, how to get what you need. So it's a really interesting way to do this, because it means that you literally remove yourself from inside the situation and you try to treat it as a novel or a movie you're watching, understanding the characters and how they behave. Number 9 is a technique we call causal layering to identify the causes. So if you're trying to make a decision about something that's going on, it's a good idea to understand the causes behind them. So find out the cause behind the events that are taking place. Don't just look at the event. Try to understand why that event is in fact occurring. Because any solution, any strategy, any decision needs to address the deepest cause behind the events. So if you think about this orange pyramid over here, you start out by asking what's really happening. And then, like, is there some kind of a pattern going on here? Is this happening every week? Why is it happening on a Friday? What's behind this pattern that causes this event to happen every Friday? And then you go to the third level and you say, well, is there a system that drives this pattern? Is there something which causes people to do what they're doing, or some kind of system which drives the behavior to cause this pattern? And then finally, ask yourself, is there something in the thinking? Is there something in the mindset of the people that designed this system that caused this system to operate in this way, that set the system up in this way? So you may find that every Friday afternoon you get low productivity. Or what is happening is that you get low productivity for the week. And the pattern behind this is that when you look at the productivity on a day-by-day basis, Friday is the worst. And you ask yourself, what's the system that drives this pattern? And it may just be that what happens on a Friday, the system is that we keep moving the goalposts. And by the time Friday comes along, the goalposts have moved and we're tired and we become demotivated. And we find that the mindset that shapes the system is that you're not being transparent to your people because you don't believe they will work hard, and therefore you try to trick them. So, I mean, that's a stupid example, but the point here really is that you're trying to find out what is driving the actual events that occur. And ultimately, it is the way you think about things which causes you to create the system that drives the pattern that shapes what's actually happening. This is a controversial one. Don't rise up to the challenge of the situation. Why do I say that? Well, we know that when you have a challenge and you rise up, you generally are highly motivated and there's a lot of emotion in it. You're not exactly in a reflective state. You're in a very reflexive state. And in a sense, Darth Vader's taken over there, and Darth Vader is not the greatest decision maker in complex situations. in times of challenge. Instead of rising up and evoking your emotions, learn to fall back on your systems and processes. So put in place the systems and processes up front. Put in place those systems and processes and follow those. Very interesting. Pilots of major aircraft and airliners are trained during a crisis to actually follow strict procedures, not to get excited and grab the controls and just do instinctively what they feel needs to be done, but quite the reverse. They are taught not to panic and to literally go through step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, the particular system and process that is put in place for when a crisis occurs on board an aircraft. And that has been proven time and again to be far more reliable, far more effective than simply taking charge like a cowboy and trying to solve the problem by simply kind of being excited and, being the hero. So fall back on your systems. We generally don't succeed by rising up to the challenge. We succeed by relying on our systems and our processes. And the last technique, which I'm just going to share with you very quickly, is to use the backcasting technique. So as we said a little earlier, at any point in time in a complex environment, as you stand in the present looking to the future, you see that there are multiple futures. So the approach of scenario planning recognizes multiple futures. And what it does is, instead of actually arguing whether future 1, future 2, or future 3 will exist, it asks, what capabilities will I need in future 1? What will I need in future 2? And what will I need in future 3? So it identifies what it's going to take to win in future 1, in future 2, and future 3. And then instead of forecasting, it backcasts and says, well, if that's what I'm going to need to survive and thrive in future 1, 2, and 3, backcast from there to the present. And that's when you find a very interesting phenomenon. You find that there is generally a high proportion of what we might call common capabilities. Sometimes 35, 40, 45% of the capabilities that are needed across a wide range of future options or future scenarios are common. And so it's a no-brainer. It's what we might call a no-regret bet to say, let's work on those common capabilities now. Let's build those common capabilities now. That's our strategy, to build those capabilities now, because we know, almost irrespective of what happens in the future, they're going to be part of the solution. And then, of course, as you move closer and closer, so you begin to be able to refine what is needed under those different situations. So, in summary then, and just to conclude, in a crisis, your decision-making is best served by being calm, being open, and being conclusive. So on behalf of Dear Dyslexic, thank you very much for taking the time to view this presentation. I hope you found it useful. If you did, contact Dear Dyslexic or myself, norman.shawn@brainlinkgroup.com, or visit our website, www.brainlinkgroup.com, and I'd be more than happy to give you any additional information and assist you in any way that I can. Thank you very much. Goodbye.